and welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Andy, on location at Kernstown Battlefield, just outside Winchester, Virginia. We're here today because of working with the Kernstown Battlefield Association. We want to say thank you to them to let us be on location, and of course to our patrons who contribute to us financially and let us get to go take the show on the road and get to go bring some Civil War history to you from location. Today we're going to do a battlefield walk, and we're going to be following the role of the 8th Ohio Infantry at the Battle of Kernstown, March 23rd, 1862. This is a cool battle in the Civil War, and one that gets kind of overlooked. Kernstown's the first battle of the Valley Campaign, and it's actually a loss for Stonewall Jackson. It's a tactical defeat, and it is generally overshadowed by his victories throughout the rest of the campaign: McDowell, Front Royal, Winchester, Cross Keys, Port Republic. But it's an important stage setter for this campaign, especially where it falls in the larger Civil War history. The battle takes place March the 23rd, 1862, which is as McClellan is embarking the Army of the Potomac to go on the Peninsula campaign. Part of him being able to take the army to go do that is his promises to the Lincoln administration that the part of the army he left behind would be able to defend Washington, hold the lower valley, and keep Confederate forces at bay. And the fact that Stonewall Jackson picked this moment to begin active campaigning in the Valley with a hard-fought battle here at Kernstown meant that the Lincoln administration had to withhold more troops from McClellan in order to defend the Upper Valley and hold the Fredericksburg, Falmouth area in central Virginia. To quickly set the scene here for Kernstown, we're standing on Pritchard's Hill, which is a large eminence south of Winchester, north of what then was a small separate village of Kernstown. Now it's the southern suburb of Winchester. As you can see behind me, this is a fantastic view of what becomes the upper Shenandoah Valley as we head south. Off to my right, to the east, we have the Blue Ridge Mountains, including Ashby's Gap. We have Moss Mountain, which divides the valley into the Shenandoah Valley and the Luray Valley. And then further off to the west, you can catch glimpses of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Now, this is a commanding position, and the Union forces here were under Colonel Nathan Kimball. He had his brigade set up here on the morning of March 23rd, 1862, after skirmishing the night before with some of Jackson's forces. The 8th Ohio, which is the unit we're going to follow today, has a pretty interesting history with the Civil War. They're raised in the Cleveland area. They're from the shores of Lake Erie. Raised as a 3-month regiment in 1861, but then re-enlisted for 3 years, and they would serve with the Army of the Potomac throughout their entire service, starting here in the Valley with the 5th Corps, which later became the 12th Corps, and then they would move to the 2nd Corps, where they became famous as part of the Gibraltar Brigade in the 3rd Division of the 2nd Corps. They were a particularly adept regiment at skirmishing. They'd been trained at it very early by their colonel, Samuel Carroll, and throughout the war, they became noted for their proficiency in light infantry, skirmishing, and that's the role they would play for a large part of the battle here. As the battle opened on the morning of March 23rd, 1862, the Confederate forces are coming up from the south, from behind me, up the Valley Pike, the central road through the valley. It was a macadamized road, which meant that even in poor weather, it had good drainage, it didn't get muddy. Soldiers and vehicles could move easily across it, which meant they could move more rapidly. It is March 1862, and the soldiers who fought here talked about it being wet and talked about it being very cold. There's still patches of snow on the ground, but it wasn't actively snowing or raining or anything like that, but it certainly was, certainly weather was part of the factor with the battle here, though it wasn't as something like Mill Springs where, it was raining so hard that it affected how the soldiers were fighting. But the 8th Ohio started the day by being in skirmish order, by going and scouting out down to the south towards Opequon Church, which is just off about a mile away off to our southeast from here. As they're moving down there, Lieutenant Colonel Franklin Sawyer, who's commanding the battalion of the 8th Ohio that's out skirmishing and scouting, comes across Chew's Virginia Horse Artillery of Turner Ashby's Confederate cavalry. Colonel Sawyer writes about how he got within 40 yards of the first Confederate gun, which he identified as a Blakely rifle, a uniquely English weapon that the Confederates had brought into service, and we know that Chew's artillery had, so it certainly tells us he knows what he was talking about, that he got that close. And so the 8th Ohio pulled back, but that meant that the initial part of this battle was focused along a north-south corridor as the Confederate cavalry and the 1st Brigades moved up the Valley Pike and started to engage the Union here on Pritchard Hill. Now, after that initial engagement, the 8th Ohio was split into 2 battalions. Colonel Carroll took 6 companies and would be fighting along the Valley Pike near Kernstown Village. Lieutenant Colonel Sawyer took 4 companies and would be on the west side of Pritchard's Hill over here. And this battalion, Sawyer's battalion, is the one that we're going to follow today because while both battalions were engaged, it's Sawyer's battalion that plays a critical role in how this battle develops. As the battle begins over here, with the Confederates starting to attack, they attack Pritchard's Hill, and they realize that this is too strong of a position. So they begin to shift their troops to the large hill you can see behind me, Sandy Ridge, which ends on the north portion with Rose Hill. As the Confederates deploy there, the Stonewall Brigade and other brigades, they take position on the hill along the stone wall, and Colonel Kimball here on Pritchard's Hill realizes that he needs to take that location. The Confederates are setting up artillery. They're engaging with Union artillery here. Colonel Kimball calls for help. He brings up another brigade under Colonel Erastus Tyler. Tyler's brigade is going to make assaults from the north to south along the spine of Sandy Ridge directly into a stone wall. Now, he picks an interesting formation. He picks a column of battalions, having each regiment stacked up behind. In the formation of Civil War troops, that is a recommended way to attack a position because it gives you a lot of depth. However, the Civil War tactics put an emphasis on things like that with speed. You want a fast column. This is a similar formation, the one that Emory Upton would use later in the war at the Mule Shoe in order to punch through in May of 1864. However, here it wasn't given the speed to give it the force it needed, and the Confederates, in a good location behind a stone wall with artillery to the rear, were able to cut up Tyler's brigade. Now, this is where we get to move here to the 8th Ohio, where they finally are going into real action. Colonel Kimball here on Pritchard's Hill decides to take his brigade and attack Sandy Ridge from the east side, which will envelop them, take them in the flank, and hopefully force Jackson's troops out of that position. The 8th Ohio is going to start in the small valley off to my left here, and we're going to see that they're going to move across Middle Road and move towards Sandy Ridge, and they're going to play an important role in turning the Confederate position. All right, we've moved now, and you can see behind us where Pritchard's Hill is, where we began this talk. We've moved about 600-700 yards west of there, across Middle Road, which you can see right behind me. And on the afternoon of March 23, 1862, this is the area that the 8th Ohio moves forward as they begin their attack. We've already talked about how Colonel Erastus Tyler, his brigade, is coming in from the north, and they're assaulting Brigadier General Richard Garnett's position on Rose Hill over to the west here. As Colonel Kimball, back on Pritchard's Hill, saw this attack developing, saw that Tyler's attack is stalling, he decides that it's time for him to launch his own assault on Sandy Ridge. Now, one more Union brigade under Colonel Sullivan is coming up towards Pritchard's Hill, which means that Kimball now has enough men to both hold Pritchard's Hill with his new reserves and launch an assault on Sandy Ridge. The 8th Ohio begins this movement. Colonel Sawyer has his 4 companies of about 190 men, and they're somewhere off on the west side of Pritchard's Hill. They get ordered forward. And from what we can tell, they cross Middle Road, somewhere off to the north here, and begin moving north-northeast towards the south-southwest, moving along the length of this ridge crest towards the northeast corner of Sandy Ridge. And as the men are moving through here, they're starting to come under fire from the Confederate guns up on the ridgetop, but they're largely not under infantry fire yet. They're moving through this. This all would have been cleared farm field in 1862, but of course it's March. At the time, this would have all just been stubble and the debris from harvest time in the fall. There would have been patches of snow and ice out here. And that means the men would have probably been wearing greatcoats or winter gear as they're moving forward. It was cold. It was still winter. So they're moving through this field. They're coming under fire. The regimental history, which Colonel Sawyer wrote, talks about them coming under fire through this area. but they're not really engaged in a heavy fighting yet. So it lets this compact group of men move forward. They're no longer skirmishing. They're formed together in a close formation, a battalion line formation, ready to come in action. And they start moving forward through this hill, up towards the rising terrain, and up towards now where Route 37 is, which cuts right through the middle of this part of the battlefield. And so as the 8th Ohio moves, their objective is the knoll right where Route 37 cuts across the end of Sandy Ridge. And because if they can reach there, they're going to be on the east flank of the Stonewall Brigade's position on Rose Hill, which means that they will be able to fire enfilade down the Confederate lines. All right, we've moved up to Sandy Ridge now, which is the objective of the 8th Ohio's attack. It's a little hard to see with the trees behind me, but Pritchard's Hill is about this way, a little under a mile away, off to our east. The Federal attacks for Erastus Tyler's brigade against the Rose Hill position were taking place off to my right. And so Tyler has his brigade and a column of regiments attacking, and eventually those Union troops have moved into a formation. They're fighting with the Confederates, and the battle is raging that way. The 8th Ohio's attack, as we've said, is moving forward through these fields to reach this objective. As Sawyer is leading his companies forward, they move up here across what's now Virginia 37, Route 37, and get up to this location here. And behind me, you can see what is a Confederate mass grave location from the Confederate dead that were buried in this area that the Kernstown Battlefield Association has located and appropriately marked. Sawyer writes about that the battle in this location was a hand-to-hand conflict. They got up here, got into the Confederate position, clubbed muskets, bayonets. The 8th Ohio got a lodgment in this area, and from here were able to fire down the Confederate line. So they're essentially turning the corner on the Confederates. As Jackson's Stonewall Brigade, as Garnett and Fulkerson's men are fighting north against Tyler's brigade, now the 8th Ohio is back here, able to fire enfilade down on them. The Confederate response is to start moving reinforcements into the area. The 21st Virginia is moving up. The 1st Virginia Battalion, the Irish Battalion, is moving up into this location. And it's a close range, very violent fight. And the 8th Ohio actually ends up refusing the flank on itself. It is now fighting two companies facing towards Rose Hill, two companies fighting up Sandy Ridge, and it sets up the rest of the Union attack. Kimball's attack is a little disjointed. It's not closely linked. But what ends up happening by happenstance is it becomes a progressive attack from the center of this position, the crux of it where the 8th Ohio is, in quick succession. The 64th Ohio, the 5th Ohio, the 84th Pennsylvania are attacking down this ridge here, taking the Confederates in the flank, forcing them to redeploy. And finally, the 14th Indiana comes across the field, sweeps up the Apple Valley Road, which is off to our left here, and comes across into the Confederates, flanking this position and collapsing this whole flank of the Confederate line here. As the Confederates have had to make their line progressively facing more and more east towards Pritchard Hill to deal with Kimball's attack, they finally get stretched out to the point they can no longer deal with it. The Confederates here are too spread out, too damaged. They collapse. And at the same time, the rest of Jackson's men, Garnett and Fulkerson's brigades that are fighting on Rose Hill, have run out of ammunition. They're taking heavy damage from the 8th Ohio that's got up here, and they eventually start falling back. Now, the 8th Ohio took some pretty bad casualties in this fight. They lost more than a quarter of the battalion that's here in the hand-to-hand fighting and in the close-range firefight. As the Union forces continue to move forward, the 8th Ohio holds this position and stays where they are. Again, they were the first battalion in this attack to move forward, and because of it, they lost pretty heavily in a battle that, losing 25% in a relatively small battle like Kernstown is pretty significant casualties for a battalion like this. What's significant for the 8th Ohio is this is their first battle, like we've talked about. They've been in small skirmishes, raids, things like that, but for a real stand-up fight, this is their first time. And for a small battalion, the 4 companies that Colonel Sawyer has here, they truly proved themselves in this battle. They took a key position, and they played an important role in turning the flank of the Stonewall Brigade, and they held their position against the counterattack, letting the rest of Kimball's attack develop, progress, and push the Confederates off this hill, seizing Sandy Ridge, and letting the Union get their tactical victory here at Kernstown. The 8th Ohio would go on to be a part of the Gibraltar Brigade. They play an important role at Antietam, the assault on the Sunken Road. They would be involved at Fredericksburg. They would be involved at Gettysburg. Famously, they're the ones who flank the north part of Pickett's charge, and they take 3 or 4 flags captured during the battle. And they would go on serving well into the summer of 1864 when the regiment would muster out and go home, one of the more celebrated regiments in the Army of the Potomac. But their first real exposure to fire is what they did here at Kernstown. I'm glad that you could come with me on this walk today to walk their footsteps, talk about their actions here, and understand how their role in a smaller battle helped set them up as the regiment that they became as the war progressed. For Civil War Digital Digest, I'm Andy. I hope you've enjoyed this walk with the 8th Ohio here at Kernstown in Winchester, Virginia. We'll catch you next time.